Chapter 1. The Bells of Veymara. The city of Veymara was alive with its usual bustle, merchants shouting from wooden stalls, arcane lanterns casting soft hues over stone-paved streets, and the murmur of 100 different voices filling the air. The scent of fresh bread, sizzling meats, and exotic spices drifted through the avenues, mingling with the distant tang of the sea breeze rolling in from the harbor. Here, in the Jade Ward, the wealthier district of Veymara, cobblestone streets led up to grand spires and temples, the banners of noble houses fluttering in the evening wind. It was a city of opportunity, trade, and ambition, a place where scholars, warriors, and thieves alike made their names. But as the sun dipped beyond the horizon, the first bell tolled from the Cathedral of the Silver Flame. A single, resonant chime, deep, hollow, then another. The sound rolled through the city, rippling across rooftops and alleyways, shaking the glass panes of shop windows. People paused mid-stride, glancing toward the cathedral's towering form, confusion and unease washing over them. Then, the flames of the street lanterns flickered blue. Shadows stretched longer than they should. The once warm air turned cold, as if a spectral wind had slithered through the streets unseen. A hush fell over the marketplace. No shouting merchants, no haggling customers. Just the wind. And then came the whisper. Soft at first, a breath against the skin. A name curling through the silence, slipping through the cracks of the city's stone walls. Lich of Veymara. The name sent a ripple of fear through the air, though few knew why. It was old, from another era, nothing more than a legend passed down by frightened grandmothers. Yet now, it was as real as the chill settling over the city. Near the center of the market, 3 figures stood still as the world around them held its breath. Caelthus, a towering barbarian, tightened his grip on the haft of his battle axe. A man of great stature and quiet presence, his broad shoulders were clad in faded leather and fur, his arms scarred from years of battle. Unlike the common folk who muttered nervously, Caelthus felt something else. A pull, a weight deep in his chest, like an invisible chain wrapped around his ribs. His hands clenched. His instincts told him to fight, but against what? Beside him, Valor, the ever-ready warrior, turned slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. Twin blades rested at his hips, sheathed but ready. His auburn hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, strands of it falling over his face as he scanned the streets. Valor was always prepared for a fight, but this wasn't a battlefield. This was something older, something unseen. Tell me that was just the wind, he muttered, his fingers twitching toward his blades. Caelthus exhaled, slow and measured. It wasn't. A third figure, moving like a shadow, flicked his tail in agitation. Solrin, the Tabaxi druid, stood a few steps away, his feline features set in deep concentration. His dark fur rippled slightly as he took in the air, his sharp emerald eyes narrowing as he scented something wrong. Magic, death, and something broken. The city is shifting, Solrin murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His ears flicked toward the cathedral. Can you feel it? The very stone beneath us. It remembers. Valor gave him a skeptical look. It remembers what? Sorin's tail flicked. He looked up toward the spiral towers of the Sanctum Arcanum, where the greatest scholars of magic kept their knowledge. The bells still tolled, the sounds sinking into his bones. A grave being disturbed. Caelthus's grip tightened on his weapon, and it just called a name. Before Valor could reply, the crowd parted violently. A figure stumbled forward, nearly collapsing to the ground. A young woman, a scholar of the Sanctum Arcanum, judging by her violet-trimmed robes. She was panting, her chest heaving, as she braced herself against the nearest stone pillar. Her dark hair was wild and unkempt, her face drenched in sweat, her eyes, filled with absolute terror, locked onto the 3 warriors. You, she gasped, pointing. You need to come with me. Now! Caelthus raised an eyebrow. And why is that? She swallowed, shaking, her fingers clutching a satchel full of loose parchment. The pages fluttered, covered in what looked like frantic scrawls, sigils, arcane glyphs, and a name repeated over and over. Lich of Veymara, she choked out, barely a whisper. He's returned. Vaylor exhaled sharply. I was really hoping you'd say something else. Solren stepped closer, his green eyes sharp. What did you see? She shuddered. A crypt, a tomb sealed for centuries, beneath the ruins of Castle Veymar. We found it today, but it was already open. Kalthus's pulse pounded in his ears. That invisible weight in his chest grew heavier. And, he asked, the scholar's fingers dug into her satchel, pulling out a single mirror shard. Its edges were jagged, but its surface was black as the void, reflecting nothing. We found this in the tomb, she whispered. The walls inside, they're covered in blood. And this mirror, it doesn't reflect the world anymore. It reflects something else. She hesitated before adding, and we heard him laugh. A slow, cold wind rippled through the streets. Kalthus's breath came slow and measured, but inside something twisted, writhing, shifting, as if something inside him recognized the name. The bells tolled once more. Vaylor adjusted the grip on his swords. Right. Guess we're going to Castle Veymar. Solren's claws flexed slightly, his expression unreadable. The dead should not walk. We need to stop this before it spreads. Kalthus took a deep breath, staring toward the distant ruins of the castle. That invisible pull in his chest was growing stronger, more insistent, like a chain leading towards something inevitable. He exhaled, gripping his axe. Then let's go see what's waiting for us. And as they turned toward the road, the last bell rang, a final hollow note that faded into the night. Chapter 2. The Road to the Castle. The ruins of Castle Veymar loomed in the distance, its blackened silhouette barely visible against the swirling storm clouds above. The air was thick with unnatural energy, the faint scent of burned incense and old parchment lingering as if something long buried had begun to stir. The road that led from Veymara to the castle had once been a stone-paved highway, a path trodden by kings and scholars. Now it was little more than a cracked ruin, overgrown with twisting roots and creeping ivy. Kalthus, Vaylor, and Solren moved swiftly, their footsteps the only sound aside from the wind cutting through the trees. The weight in Kalthus's chest had not faded. It had only grown stronger, like an invisible hand pulling him forward. He didn't know why. He just knew he had to go. They had barely left the city behind when the mist rolled in. Not the kind that drifts lazily over the hills at dawn, but something thicker, unnatural. A fog that seemed to coil and shift as if alive. Solren's fur bristled. This is no ordinary mist. Vaylor exhaled sharply, placing his hands on the hilts of his swords. No kidding. I can barely see 5 feet in front of me. Kalthus rolled his shoulders, his grip tightening on his axe. The weight in his chest was now a pounding ache, something deeply wrong but impossible to name. Then, a whisper. Soft at first, then many. They are coming. Soren froze. We are not alone. And then the dead stepped from the fog. The first knight emerged, his rusted armor barely clinging to his decayed body. His eyes glowed with cold blue fire, his skeletal fingers gripping a blade wreathed in shadow. Then another, and another. They did not charge. They did not snarl. They merely walked, slow and methodical, their hollow eyes fixed on the party. Vaylor drew his swords, taking a steady breath. I count 7, maybe more in the mist. Kalthus flexed his fingers around his axe. Then we kill them all. The first knight moved, faster than expected, his blade arcing toward Kalthus's throat. He barely brought his axe up in time, the force of the clash sending him sliding back across the damp stone road. They were strong, far too strong. Vaylor lunged, his twin swords flashing as he clashed with a second knight, sparks flying as steel met steel. These aren't just undead, they remember how to fight. Solren raised his hands, whispering an incantation as roots burst from the ground, twisting around the legs of a knight to hold it in place. But the knight moved through them as if they were nothing. Solren's ears flattened. That's concerning, Kelthus roared, forcing back his opponent with a heavy strike before turning to Valor. Then we take their heads. No head, no memory. Valor grinned. I like the way you think. The fight turned into a deadly dance. Swords clashing, magic crackling. The warriors forced to work together to counter the knight's unrelenting precision. For every one they struck down, another rose again, moving as if it had never fallen. The weight in Kalthus's chest became painful, a dull ache every time he locked eyes with one of them. As if they knew him, as if he knew them. Then, the tide turned against them. From the mist, a larger figure emerged, a phantom knight clad in spectral armor, his massive greatsword dragging across the stone. He lifted his hollow gaze toward Kalthus and charged. Kalthus barely had time to react. The impact sent him flying, his body slamming into the twisted roots of an old tree. The air was knocked from his lungs, stars bursting across his vision. The phantom knight raised its blade for the killing blow, and then the arrow came. The black feathered arrow struck the phantom knight directly in the eye socket, the force sending it staggering backward. A whistle pierced the air, sharp, controlled. Then from the mist, a figure stepped forward. Draped in a dark hooded cloak, dual curved daggers glinting at his sides. An elven figure moved through the battlefield like a ghost. His movements were fluid, effortless. His presence commanding, yet unseen. Calyx. Before the phantom knight could recover, Calyx was already upon it. He twisted in midair, rolling over its shoulders in a blur, before plunging a dagger into its exposed neck. The creature snarled, swinging wildly, but Calyx was gone before the blade could find him. A second arrow struck home, burying itself into the creature's chest. Calyx landed gracefully beside Kalthus, offering a mocking smirk. You look like you could use some help. Kalthus coughed, regaining his footing. You always make entrances this dramatic? Calyx flicked his hood back slightly, revealing sharply defined features, piercing green eyes, and the smirk of someone who never lost a fight. I try. Valor dodged a knight's strike, slicing through its spinal column in one fluid motion before glancing over. Who the hell are you? Calyx twirled a dagger. Your best chance at surviving. Kalthus cracked his neck. The weight in his chest was still there. But now he had an outlet. He grinned. All right then, let's finish this. With Calyx joining the fight, the tide shifted. Calyx moved like a ghost, his daggers finding the gaps in the knight's armor. Valor and Kalthus fought side by side, their strikes coordinated, deadly. Solrin's magic reinforced their attacks, twisting roots into spears, calling down lightning to shatter the dead. One by one, the phantom knight and his warriors fell, this time not rising again. The mist began to recede. The battle was over, and they had won. Kalthus exhaled, rolling his shoulders. That was rough. Valor sheathed his swords, smirking. Nothing we couldn't handle. Calyx dusted himself off. I'm impressed. Most people don't last that long against the dead. Solrin wiped blood from his fur, his emerald eyes focused on the castle ahead. This was only the beginning. Calyx followed his gaze. You're heading to Castle Veymara, aren't you? Kalthus nodded. Yeah, and you're coming with us. Calyx chuckled. You really don't have a choice. You'll need me. The four of them turned toward the distant ruins, the storm roaring above. They had survived the road. They had won. But the castle was waiting. Chapter 3. The road to the castle and the Grand Hall of Mirrors. The road to Castle Veymara was no longer a road. It was a scar upon the land. The once proud stone path was now fractured and overgrown, its stones cracked by time and creeping ivy. The trees lining the path stood twisted, gnarled, as if they had been reaching for something that never came. A thick mist clung to the ground, curling around their boots, shifting as though it were alive. Above them the storm churned, heavy clouds writhing unnaturally, swallowing what little moonlight there was. Kalthus, Valor, Solrin, and Calyx moved cautiously, their breath visible in the unnatural cold. Calix flicked his gaze toward Kalthus. That weight in your chest still there? Kalthus clenched his fists. Yeah, stronger now. Calix nodded. Good. Then we're going the right way. Soren's tail flicked as he scanned the darkened forest around them. Something is watching us. Vaylor tightened his grip on his swords. If it wants a fight, it can come out and face us. The silence was thick. Too thick. Even the wind had died, leaving only the sound of their own footsteps against the crumbling road. Then, the castle came into view. The ruins of Castle Veymara loomed ahead, silhouetted against the storm. The ancient spires, once symbols of power, now stood broken and hollow, like the ribs of a long-dead beast. The main gate, a monstrous thing of iron and old sigils, stood slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. The once pristine banners that hung above it were torn, faded, their colors long drained away. Vaylor let out a low whistle. Well, that's inviting, Calix smirked. Let's knock, shall we? As they stepped forward, the gate groaned, not from their touch, but as if something unseen had pushed it open for them. A gust of cold air spilled out from the darkness beyond, thick with the scent of old parchment, wax, and something faintly metallic. Kalthus stepped forward first, his axe resting on his shoulder. The others followed. The castle swallowed them whole. They passed through the outer halls, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. The architecture was still intact, marble columns rising to great vaulted ceilings, chandeliers swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen breeze. Yet there was no dust, no decay, just an unnatural stillness, as if the castle had been preserved in the moment it fell. Then they reached the grand hall of mirrors. The doors opened soundlessly, revealing a room so vast it seemed impossible. The walls stretched on endlessly, lined with towering mirrors, framed in obsidian and silver, their glass polished to an unnatural shine. The chandeliers above them were lit, yet no fire burned in them, just a cold, bluish glow, casting eerie reflections in the glass. Vaylor stepped inside first, eyeing the mirrors. Why do I feel like this room is waiting for us? Kalthus's chest ached more than ever, the unseen weight pressing against his ribs. His gaze drifted to the mirrors. He saw himself staring back, but something felt off. Soren's ears twitched. These are not reflections. Not truly. Calix exhaled, adjusting his daggers. Then what are they? The mirrors rippled, like water disturbed. Then the visions began. The mirrors blurred, then reshaped. Kalthus found himself somewhere else. A chamber of stone and candlelight standing before a throne carved from shadow itself. A figure sat upon it. Kalthus knew him instantly. Lich of Veymara. But the Lich did not move to attack. He simply watched. You feel it, don't you? Kalthus looked down. A chain of black glass was wrapped around his chest, binding him to the throne itself. Idric's voice was calm, amused. You are not my slayer, Kalthus. You are my foundation, my anchor. You always have been. Kalthus's own hands moved without him, reaching to grip the chain, feeling the pulse of unholy energy through his fingers. And for the first time, he knew it was true. The mirror shattered, then rebuilt itself, and Vaylor was no longer in the castle. He was in a palace, a warm hall of gold and light, filled with nobles laughing over wine, voices full of joy, ambition, and power. And Vaylor was one of them. He wore Adric's robes, his hands draped in rings of power, his voice commanding attention. He spoke of future conquests, of immortality not as a curse but a gift. Then the scene shifted, the light fading, the warmth dying. He saw the same nobles, now turning on him, fear in their eyes. He saw the flames, the betrayal, the knives in the dark. Vaylor gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been stabbed himself. Idric's voice whispered through the mirror. Would you have done differently? If they came for you, Vaylor, would you not fight back? And in that moment, Vaylor did not know how to answer. The mirror shifted. Soren saw himself standing on a battlefield of stone and ruin. But something was wrong. Across from him stood Kalthus, Valar, and Calix. Their eyes were dark, their weapons drawn. And Solrin was alone. He raised his staff, his fur bristling. "What happened?" Valar stepped forward, his voice empty. "You are the last?" Kalthus's axe was coated in black flame. "You should have knelt." Calix smirked. "It didn't have to be this way." Then they attacked. Solrin snapped back to reality, gasping. The vision had felt real, tangible, a warning, a promise. Calix's mirror did not show him suffering. It showed him standing in triumph. He saw himself at the castle gates, the people of Veymara cheering his name. His daggers were clean, his enemies gone, the Lich defeated. He was a hero. The people loved him. Calix grinned. "Well, that's reassuring." Then, Solrin turned to the second mirror. Solrin's gaze locked onto one final mirror, identical to the others. But instead of reflecting the room as it was, it showed a deeper, mirrored version of the hall. The same, yet off. Then, a hand reached out. Solrin staggered back. The moment their gazes met, the vision changed. The hall became ruined, decayed, the chandeliers fallen, the mirrors now iron-barred cages, filled with wraith-like figures, their twisted smiles pressed against the glass. Then, before he could move, the mirror shattered. Reality flipped. The next breath they took, they were no longer in the Hall of Mirrors. They were in the prison version of it. The wraiths were free. Their grins widened. And they attacked. Chapter 4, The Battle of the Mirror Wraiths. The hall was silent, but only for a moment. Then the wraiths moved. Their forms flickered, half real, their twisted grins stretched too wide, their eyes pools of ink, reflecting nothing. They floated toward the heroes, shifting like shadows stretched by unseen hands. Kalthus gritted his teeth, raising his axe. "Here we go." Valar drew his swords, spinning them once before settling into a stance. "I've fought worse." Solrin flicked his ears, his claws flexing. "They aren't alive. That makes them dangerous." Calix sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Guess we're doing this the hard way." Then the wraiths attacked. The mirror wraiths moved unnaturally, their attacks phasing in and out of reality, striking from angles that shouldn't exist. Kalthus swung his great axe, but his wraith mirrored his movement perfectly, meeting him in a perfectly synchronized strike, their weapons clashing in an unnatural echo. The force of the impact sent Kalthus skidding backward, his breath coming ragged. Valar's wraith struck fast, its sword a shadowed reflection of his own. Valar parried, countered, but every move he made was mimicked, every strike met with equal precision. It was him. It was his skill turned against him. Solrin's wraith did not fight conventionally. Instead, it twisted his magic, the vines he summoned rotting into blackened chains, his lightning turning into cursed sparks that lashed back at him. Calix fought like a phantom against himself, his wraith moving faster, sharper, predicting his movements before he could even think them. For every strike he landed, he took one in return. They were losing. Then, Valar saw an opening. His wraith lunged, aiming for his throat. Valar ducked low, spun, and with a single vicious slash, severed the wraith's form in two. The wraith screamed, not just with its own voice, but with all of them. And then they all vanished. Kalthus staggered back, panting. "What?" Solrin's ears flattened. They were connected. Destroy one, destroy all. Valar exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Well, at least I picked the right one to kill." The hall was silent once more. But something had changed. The air was colder, the mirrors emptier. And Kalthus was still standing in the center of the room, gripping his axe tighter than before. The four warriors took a moment to breathe, scanning the room now that the wraiths were gone. Calix was the first to break the silence. "We should look around. If Adric left something behind, we need to find it." They split up, searching the hall for anything of value. Valar found an old ledger, its pages brittle but intact, detailing the final days of Castle Veymar. He frowned, reading aloud. The Lord of Veymar has sealed himself within the vaults below the castle. He has forsaken the old ways. He has made himself eternal. Solrin narrowed his eyes. Made himself eternal? That doesn't sound like a standard phylactery ritual. Calix found a set of old scrolls, their ink faded, but still legible enough to read. His eyes scanned them quickly, his expression darkening. This isn't normal lichcraft. There's something different. He traced a line with his finger. The heart of another beats in place of my own. Should the heart cease, my curse is lifted. Solrin frowned. Heart? That's vague. Could mean a lot of things. Kalthus stiffened. He looked away, pretending to examine the cracks in one of the mirrors. He knew exactly what it meant. The weight in his chest was not just discomfort, it was Idric. He clenched his jaw. He couldn't tell them. Not yet. Instead, he spoke in a low voice. We shouldn't waste time. The longer we're here, the more dangerous it gets. Calix gave him a glance, but didn't press further. Agreed. Once they were sure there was nothing else of value, the four of them regrouped in the center of the hall. Sorin was the first to speak. We need to talk about the visions. Kalthus's grip tightened on his axe. Vaylor ran a hand through his hair. Yeah, that was unsettling. Calix smirked, crossing his arms. Mine was fine. I saw us winning. Big victory. Cheers. Crowds. Me looking very good in a hero's cloak. Vaylor shot him a look. Really? That's it? Calix shrugged. I mean, it's not my fault if fate likes me. Kalthus forced himself to breathe evenly. He had to lie, or at least alter the truth. He wouldn't tell them about the chains, about how Idrich had called him the anchor. So instead, he kept his voice level. Mine was vague, just shadows, figures whispering. He paused, then added, Didn't tell me much. Vaylor and Calix nodded, satisfied. But Solrin's sharp emerald eyes locked onto him. He didn't press, but he didn't believe him either. Solrin exhaled, looking at the others. Mine wasn't vague. I saw us fighting. But it wasn't us. It was us, but changed, corrupted, twisted. I was alone. The words settled heavily in the air. Vaylor let out a low breath. Mine was different too. I was him, Idric. Before all of this, I saw him as a noble. I felt what he felt, and when they betrayed him, I understood why he did what he did. The words made Solrin's ears flick. That's dangerous. Vaylor nodded. I know, but if we want to stop him, we need to understand him. His fall wasn't random. He did this for a reason. Kalthus forced himself to remain silent. Because he already knew what Idric's reason was. It was him. After a few moments of silence, Calix stretched. All right, well, we know more than we did before. We know Idric's not a normal lich. We know he did something different. Vaylor nodded. And we know he has to be stopped before this spreads. Sorin crossed his arms. And that means going deeper into the castle. Kalthus inhaled slowly. He felt like a liar in his own skin, like a weight was pressing down on his lungs. He kept the secret anyway. Because if he told them, he would have to ask them to kill him. And Kalthus wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Ritual Chamber. The corridors of Castle Veymar had grown darker, the air thick with something unseen, something pressing against their skin like an invisible weight. Solrin could feel it in the stone, the way the very foundation of the castle resisted them. Vaylor could hear it in the silence, a silence that felt aware. Calix moved with cautious steps, his usual air of confidence replaced with cold calculation. And Kalthus felt the pull again, stronger, more relentless. It was no longer a distant ache. It was a chain wrapped around his ribs, dragging him forward. And it led them deeper. At the end of a twisting passage, they found it. A great iron door, covered in arcane etchings, its surface untouched by time. Unlike the rest of the castle, which had been consumed by ruin and decay, this door was pristine, guarded, preserved. Solrin stepped forward, pressing his hand against the cold metal. A pulse of magic rippled outward, forcing the torches along the walls to flare violently. This is it. Valor unsheathed his swords, glancing at the others. Ready? Kaltus rolled his shoulders, forcing down the sense of dread clawing at his chest. Let's get this over with. Calix smirked. I just hope whatever's behind this door doesn't explode. The door swung open on its own, and beyond it lay the ritual chamber. The room was massive, its ceiling lost to shadows, its walls lined with towering shelves stacked with forgotten tomes and crumbling scrolls. A series of intricate runes spiraled outward from the center, forming a perfect circle inlaid with silver and obsidian. But the true heart of the room was the book. It sat upon a pedestal of black stone, floating inches above the surface, its pages turning slowly without a breeze. The leather binding was smooth, untouched by age, but the symbols along its spine twisted and changed when looked at directly. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Calix exhaled, rubbing his arms. I don't like this. Valor ignored him, stepping toward the floating tome. This is what he used. Solrin narrowed his eyes. Be careful. Valor reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed the leather, the entire room pulsed with raw energy. A shockwave of arcane power erupted outward, making their reflections ripple in the polished floor. The book's pages flipped wildly, symbols glowing with a cold blue light. Runes on the walls coming alive like whispers skittering through the air. Then, the whispers formed words. A soul untethered to stone, bound instead to life. Valor snapped his head toward the others. It's not a phylactery. Solrin stepped forward, scanning the glowing runes. He didn't bind himself to an object. He bound himself to a person. Calix let out a low breath. Okay, that's horrible. But that means we just need to find this person and kill them, right? Valor ran a hand through his hair, thinking. It can't be just anyone. Whoever the anchor is, they have to be from a family that existed when Edric was alive. If they weren't alive back then, the bond wouldn't work. Solrin nodded. Exactly. He had to anchor himself to a lineage strong enough to survive the ages. It wouldn't have been random. It had to be a family that stood the test of time. Calix exhaled. All right, so how many of those families are still around? Kalthus hesitated. Then in a voice that felt too heavy, he answered. 4. The room went still. Valor turned toward him. 4? Kalthus didn't meet their eyes. Instead, he stared at the glowing runes, his voice measured. The Veymara nobles fell when Edric did, but 4 families survived. The Solmars, the Kastovs, the Dernharts. He swallowed. And mine. Silence. Solrin's sharp gaze flicked to Kalthus, reading everything unsaid in his stance in his voice. Calix, however, let out a short breath. Well, that narrows it down. At least we're not looking for some random peasant. Kalthus said nothing, because he already knew the truth. Before they could process what they had just uncovered, the air shook. A deep, reverberating boom echoed through the chamber, shaking the walls, making the torches flicker violently. Then, the door slammed shut behind them. A figure stepped from the darkness, towering, its form shrouded in black mist. It was humanoid in shape, clad in tarnished ancient armor, wielding 2 massive iron maces, their spiked heads dripping with a strange, blackened ichor. But it was its face, or rather, its faces, that made them freeze. Because there were 4 of them, one for each of them, their own twisted, empty-eyed visages, staring back, mocking and silent. Kalthus's own reflection grinned at him, a grin too wide. The knight lifted its twin maces and attacked. The knight moved with impossible speed, its maces swinging in wide, devastating arcs, shattering the stone floor where they landed. Valor dodged left, rolling as a mace nearly took his head off. He came up with his swords in hand, slashing at its side, but the knight barely flinched. Calix flickered through the shadows, landing a quick stab at its back, but the wound closed instantly, as if it had never been there. Solrin lifted a hand, summoning twisting roots to bind its limbs, but the knight ripped free effortlessly, snapping the vines like thread. Kalthus met the knight's onslaught head-on, blocking one of its massive strikes with his axe, the force sending cracks through the stone beneath his feet. It was relentless, stronger, faster. For the first time, they were losing ground. Kalthus's own twisted face on the knight grinned at him, whispering something just beneath hearing. Kalthus snarled, "Shut up." The knight swung both maces down toward him, a strike that would shatter bone and steel alike. But Kalthus roared, twisting his axe upward, catching the attack at an impossible angle, using the momentum to swing himself around its guard. And then he struck. The axe buried itself into the knight's throat, and with one savage pull, Kalthus ripped it free, decapitating the monster. The knight staggered, its four faces twisting, screaming silently, and then it collapsed into dust. Silence followed. Calix let out a shaky breath. That thing was stronger than it should have been. Valor nodded, gripping his swords tighter. And it barely flinched when we hit it. Solrin exhaled, his eyes flicking to Kalthus. You hesitated back there. Kalthus looked away. I handled it. Solrin frowned but said nothing. Because for the first time he wasn't sure they would win. And Kalthus already knew they wouldn't. Chapter 6. A moment's respite. The cold air outside bit deep, a stark contrast to the oppressive, unnatural stillness within Castle Veymar. The four warriors had left the ruined halls behind, stepping onto the crumbling courtyard, where the last remnants of the moon peeked through the ever-churning storm clouds above. Kalthus exhaled slowly, leaning against a broken stone pillar, his battle-worn axe resting across his lap. The weight in his chest had not left him. If anything, it had grown heavier. Valor sat nearby, rolling his shoulder with a wince, his twin swords laid across his knees. I'm not saying I'm tired, but that thing almost caved my ribs in. Calix smirked, tossing a dagger between his hands. I'll admit, I don't usually go toe-to-toe with giant knights carrying two maces. But hey, first time for everything. Solrin was the only one still standing, his tail flicking as he surveyed the ruined battlements. His sharp green eyes gleamed in the dim light. That thing was too strong. We barely managed to kill it, and it wasn't even the worst thing in there. Valor sighed. Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. If that was just a guardian or whatever, what does that say about the Lich? The words hung between them, heavy with the reality they had been trying to ignore. Calix clicked his tongue. I hate to say it, but we might be in over our heads. Solrin turned, his voice quiet. We're not strong enough. Kalthus's grip tightened around his axe. The words cut deep, but Kalthus couldn't blame them. Solrin was right. They had barely walked away from that fight, and the real enemy was still ahead of them. Valor leaned forward, staring at the ground. I thought we had this in the bag. Go in, find the Lich, kill him, walk out as heroes. But this is different. It's like we're fighting something that was built to survive us. Calix sighed, rubbing his jaw. We don't even know if we're hitting the right target. We still don't have the anchor. Solrin nodded. And we're assuming the Lich is still in the castle. Kalthus looked up at that. Sorin continued, crossing his arms. Think about it. Why stay here? Why leave behind all these traps and visions and monsters if he's still waiting for us in some throne room? Calix hummed. So what, we're fighting an empty castle? Valor shook his head. No, I think he's still here, but if he's tied to the anchor, then he doesn't need to hide in a crypt. He could be anywhere, watching. A heavy silence fell between them. Kalthus exhaled slowly. This was it. This was where the doubt could break them. So he crushed it. Kalthus pushed himself up, rolling his shoulders. It doesn't matter. The others looked at him. Kalthus's face was set like stone, his golden eyes hard with something unyielding, unshakable. We're not walking away from this. We came here to kill the Lich, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Solrin's ears flicked. Even if we don't know where he is? Kalthus nodded. Even then. Calix raised an eyebrow. That's a hell of a gamble. Kalthus met his gaze, unwavering. Not a gamble, a war. We're going to end this one way or another. Vaylor studied him for a long moment, then sighed, a small grin playing at the edge of his lips. Well, if you're that confident, I guess I don't have a choice but to follow, huh? Soren exhaled, still unconvinced. Confidence doesn't change the fact that we don't have the information we need. Kalthus shrugged. Then we get it. Calyx leaned against a broken column, smirking. Oh, and how do you suggest we do that? Kalthus turned toward the castle. We go deeper. We find more records, more answers. We figure out exactly what Edric did and how to undo it. Vaylor nodded. And if we're lucky, we find the anchor before we find him. Soren crossed his arms. And if we don't? Kalthus's grip tightened on his axe. Then we kill him the hard way. The fire in Kalthus's voice was enough to steady them, but the doubt still lingered. Soren gave him one last look, searching for something. Kalthus met his gaze without flinching. Finally, Soren exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Fine. But if we're doing this, we do it smart. No more running blind. Calyx grinned. So dungeon crawling then? Vaylor cracked his knuckles. Sounds like the best plan we've got. Kalthus turned back to the castle, staring at the broken halls they had just left. The answers were inside. They had to be. And if they weren't, then Kalthus would keep lying. Until the end. Chapter 7. The Hope Before the Fall. The dungeons of Castle Veymara were older than the city itself, carved deep into the black rock beneath the castle's foundations. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, wax, and aged parchment. The walls lined with crumbling shelves of forgotten records, stacks of sealed scrolls lying undisturbed for centuries. Kalthus, Vaylor, Soren, and Calyx moved carefully through the dimly lit corridors, their boots echoing against the ancient floor. There was no oppressive magic, no whispering ghosts, only the weight of history, and somewhere within it, the truth. Kalthus felt no fear. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt hope. They could break this. They could stop this without anyone dying. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. Calyx whistled low as he ran a hand over the spines of dust-covered tomes, his sharp eyes scanning the faded lettering. A lot of history in here. If I weren't actively trying to stop a cursed king from ruining my day, I'd actually take some time to read this stuff. Vaylor smirked. Since when do you read? Calyx gave him an exaggerated look of offense. I just prefer books that involve poisons, blades, and questionable moral decisions. Soren ignored them, reaching for a sealed scroll marked with the Veymara crest. He unfurled it carefully, his feline eyes scanning the ancient script. This is a record of noble lineages, who served under Edric, which families were exiled, which ones were executed. He trailed off, then nodded. We can rule out the Kastovs and the Dernhardts. Both were wiped out before Edric fell. Vaylor exhaled. That leaves only two. Calyx rolled his shoulders. So it's either the Solmars or... He glanced at Kalthus. Kalthus kept his face neutral. Or mine. The silence was heavy, but Kalthus didn't let it sit for long. He straightened, confidence unwavering. Doesn't matter. We'll find a way to break the curse before it comes to that. Calyx studied him, then shrugged. You're real sure of that, huh? Kalthus nodded, his voice firm. Yeah, we're not killing an innocent person. We'll find another way. Soren folded his arms. And if there isn't one? Kalthus didn't even hesitate. There is. We just haven't found it yet. And for the first time in this nightmare, he truly believed it. They moved deeper, pushing aside collapsed shelves and rusted metal crates, searching for anything that could give them more information. Then, Vaylor found it. An aged manuscript, bound in deep crimson leather, its pages still intact beneath layers of dust. He opened it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed through its contents. Soren stepped closer. What is it? Vaylor's expression shifted, first confusion, then realization. It's a contingency, a way to break the bond without killing the anchor. Kalthus's heart slammed against his ribs. What does it say? Vaylor's fingers traced the old script. It's complicated, but, he frowned. The ritual is unfinished? No, altered. Someone changed the original text. Calix leaned in. Meaning? Sorin exhaled. Meaning someone didn't want there to be an alternative. Kalthus clenched his jaw. But there is one. Vaylor nodded. There is. We just have to figure it out. For the first time since stepping into this cursed castle, they had hope. Then, the torches flickered. The air turned deathly cold. Maw! And the laughter began. The shadows at the edge of the chamber twisted, pooling together into a human shape, its form flickering between solid and spectral, its cloak of darkness billowing like smoke. Lich of Veymara stepped forward, his void black eyes gleaming with amusement. Ah, how delightful! How utterly, deliciously predictable. Kalthus gritted his teeth, gripping his axe tighter. You. Vaylor rolled his shoulders. You came to die again? Idric chuckled. Oh, my dear children, you truly believe you have won something, don't you? His gaze drifted to the book, the pages still open on the manuscript they had just found. Did you think you could defy me with ink and paper? Calix shrugged. Well, we were going to try. Idric lifted a hand, and the torches died instantly, plunging the room into near-total darkness. His voice slithered through the chamber, a whisper that curled around their thoughts. You have no power here. You were always meant to lose. Kalthus felt something deep within him tremble, a part of himself that recognized those words, even if he didn't understand why. Then, Sorin moved. The Tabaxi's hands crackled with emerald energy, his magic pulsing like a living storm. We're done listening to you. Before Idric could react, Sorin unleashed everything. A surge of pure, unfiltered magical force exploded from his hands, a wave of emerald fire, lightning, and nature's wrath intertwined into one unstoppable blast. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking, the very air igniting from the sheer power Sorin had called upon. The spell struck Idric directly and ripped him apart. The Lich screamed, his body disintegrating instantly, his form breaking apart like shattered glass. The torches flared back to life, the magic in the room settling into an eerie silence. Then, Calix started laughing. That's it? That was the big bad? He wiped a tear from his eye. You're telling me we went through all that for a guy who just disintegrates in one shot? Vaylor let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. I'll admit, I expected more. Kalthus couldn't help but grin, gripping Sorin's shoulder. Hell of a shot, Sorin. The Tabaxi flicked his tail. If I knew it was that easy, I would have done it earlier. For the first time, they felt true relief. It was over. Then, Kalthus staggered. His chest burned, his vision blurred, and a cold voice echoed in his skull. Oh, you poor misguided fools. The torches dimmed again, the air shuddering. Not with wind, but with something wrong. The shadows on the walls deepened, curling unnaturally as the room itself seemed to breathe. A slow, mocking chuckle filled the chamber. Did you think it would be that easy? Kalthus gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He staggered forward, his chest seizing, his heartbeat pounding wildly. Sorin reached for him. Kalthus? Vaylor stepped forward. What's happening? Kalthus clutched his chest, but it wasn't his heartbeat. It was something else. Something wrong. Idric's voice echoed from within him. You feel it now, don't you? That is me. Kalthus froze. He was the anchor. Chapter 8. The Breaking of Kalthus. The moment Idric's cold hand touched Kalthus's shoulder, the world twisted. Kalthus staggered, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his entire body burning with something he couldn't contain. His bones creaked, muscles swelled, veins darkened, his flesh turning stone gray as his form grew, warped, transformed. The gold of his eyes vanished, replaced by deep, glowing silver, his pupils narrowing to slits. His hands trembled, his axe growing heavier. But it wasn't the same weapon anymore. Shadow curled around it, stretching, shaping it into something wrong. And then he laughed. It was his voice, but not. Twisted, darker, detached. Kalthus was no longer Kalthus. Idrik stepped back, watching the transformation with a satisfied smirk. His own body shifted, the last remnants of his once human form shedding away. His robes turned to smoke, swirling around him like a living shroud, his skeletal face now hidden beneath the hood of a reaper. Only those void black, burning eyes visible within the darkness. In his hands, a scythe formed, a weapon of pure malice, its long, curved blade wreathed in black flame, tendrils of it licking at the air as though hungry. Idrik tilted his head, twirling the scythe with effortless ease. Marvelous. Vaylor and Calyx immediately stepped back, their instincts screaming at them to run. Solrin, however, had no time to react. Kalthus turned toward him and attacked. Solrin barely had time to raise his staff before Kalthus was on him, moving faster than he should, his form shifting through shadows, appearing and reappearing at impossible angles. Kalthus's axe swung for Solrin's head, and the tabaxi barely ducked in time, rolling to the side as the weapon cleaved through solid stone like butter. Solrin's ears flattened. "Kalthus, stop!" Kalthus laughed again, his voice unnatural, layered with something else. "You think I can stop this? You think I want to?" He lunged again, his shadow warping unnaturally, his attacks faster, stronger, more vicious than they had ever been. Solrin countered where he could, calling on the earth to rise, summoning gale-force winds. But Kalthus cut through everything as if it were paper. Kalthus was overwhelming him, and Solrin couldn't bring himself to fight back. Vaylor and Calyx charged Idrik, their weapons flashing through the dim light. Idrik didn't block. He simply moved, his form fading like mist, his laughter echoing from everywhere at once. Vaylor struck first, his twin swords glowing with radiant energy, aiming directly for Idrik's chest. The blades passed through nothing, hitting only cold air. And before Vaylor could recover, the scythe came down. Vaylor barely managed to twist away, but the blade clipped his arm, and the moment it did, his entire body convulsed in pain, the magic of the weapon corrupting him from within. Calyx came from behind, daggers aimed for Idrik's spine. Idrik whipped around, his burning eyes locking onto him, and a shockwave of raw death magic blasted outward, sending Calyx flying across the chamber. He hit the wall hard, his vision blurring. Idrik smiled. "You two bore me." And then he turned toward Kalthus and Solrin. Solrin had fought with everything he had, but he was losing. Kalthus was too fast, too powerful, too relentless. A final blow sent Solrin skidding across the stone, his back slamming against a cracked pillar. He tried to stand, but his legs shook, his strength fading. Kalthus approached slowly, his silver eyes glowing with triumph. "No more running." Solrin's chest heaved, his claws flexing weakly. "Kalthus!" For a moment, just a moment, his friend's face flickered through the madness, his grip hesitating. "Then," Idrik spoke, "finish it." Kalthus's face twisted, and he swung the axe. Vaylor and Calyx watched in horror as Solrin collapsed unmoving. "Solrin!" Vaylor roared, trying to run to him, but Idrik was already there. He lifted a skeletal hand, his void black gaze locking onto Vaylor, and he whispered a single word. "Die." The spell struck instantly. Vaylor's entire body seized, his breath catching in his throat, his heart stopping in his chest. The world tilted, his vision blackening, the weight of death itself crushing him in an instant. Idrik watched him with amusement. "I'd let you say your last words, but I'm afraid you won't have the breath for them." Vaylor sank to his knees, his life slipping away. He was dying, and he knew it. Calyx's mind raced. Solrin was down. Vaylor was seconds from death. Kalthus was gone. They had lost. There was only one choice left. Before Idrik could finish Vaylor off, Calyx shifted, his form warped, his body growing, fur sprouting across his limbs as his bones cracked and stretched. Within seconds, he was no longer an elf. He was an owlbear. With a deafening roar, Calyx charged. He scooped Valor onto his back, then snatched Soren in his massive talons, his sharp eyes locking onto the castle entrance. Kalthus turned toward him, his axe ready, but Calyx was faster. He barreled past him, slamming his bulk through the stone doorway, sending debris cascading behind him. He ran. Through the ruined halls, down the twisted corridors, his massive paws thundering against the ground, his breathing ragged. Behind him, he could hear Edric's laughter. Kalthus's laughter. "You can run, little bird." Edric's voice echoed through the castle walls, curling through the corridors like a whisper on the wind. "But you can never hide." Calyx didn't stop, didn't look back. He ran. He ran until the castle was behind them, until the cold night swallowed them whole, until the lights of the city of Veymara finally came into view. And only then, only when he was sure they had escaped, did he finally collapse, his form shifting back to his elven body, his breath coming in gasping sobs. Valor was barely breathing. Soren was unmoving. And Kalthus was gone. Chapter 9. The Call to War. Calyx stumbled into the city, his body aching, burned out, every muscle screaming in exhaustion. The moon hung low, its silver light casting long shadows over the stone walls of Veymara, the city now eerily quiet, as if it could feel the weight of his failure. The gates were open, but the moment he set foot inside, a dozen guards surrounded him, spears raised, voices sharp. "Halt!" Calyx barely had the strength to lift his head. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with blood, but his green eyes still burned with the fire of survival. "Stand down," came a commanding voice. A figure stepped forward, a woman clad in flowing blue robes, her hands crackling with arcane energy. Archmage Lyrian, the city's highest-ranking mage. Behind her, several other mages, city officials, and high-ranking guards gathered, their expressions grave, expectant. Lyrian's sharp gaze scanned him, taking in the unconscious Valor draped across his back and the motionless Soren in his arms. "Where are the others?" she asked. Calyx's throat was dry, hoarse. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his chest. He couldn't say it. He couldn't say Kalthus was gone. Lyrian saw the answer in his eyes before he could speak. Her expression hardened. "Get them to the healers. Now." The temple halls were filled with the hum of magic, the air saturated with divine energy as the city's most powerful clerics and healers worked tirelessly. Valor lay on a stone altar, his skin ashen, his pulse weak. Soren lay beside him, his fur matted, his chest rising only slightly, as if he were on the edge of the veil itself. Oh, the high cleric, a broad-shouldered elven man with golden tattoos lining his arms, stepped forward. He placed his hands over their bodies, his voice low, resonant as he called upon the gods. A blinding golden light filled the chamber. Calyx, leaning against a nearby pillar, watched as the magic poured into his friends, knitting together broken bones, shattered veins, and the lingering shadow of death itself. Valor's breath hitched, then steadied. Soren's eyes snapped open, glowing with residual energy before returning to normal. Calyx let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They lived. A few hours later, Valor, Soren, and Calyx sat in the great hall of the Veymara Council, their wounds healed but their spirits heavy. Before them, the highest officials of the city, including Archmage Lyrian, High Cleric Fenrir, and General Realith, stood in a grim semicircle. The council had one question. What happened in the castle? Valor's voice was hollow. We lost. Soren's claws flexed against the wooden table. We were supposed to destroy the Lich. We thought we did. Calyx exhaled sharply. And then he came back. He looked up, his gaze dark. And we lost Kalthus. The words hung in the air, heavy, bitter, undeniable. Lyrian's expression remained unreadable. You mean he was killed? Calix hesitated. No, his jaw clenched. We lost him to Edric. Silence. General Ralith's face darkened, his gauntlets creaking as he crossed his arms. Then he is now our enemy. Valor slammed his fist against the table. No, he's still in there. We can bring him back. Calix's voice was cold, sharp. You don't know that. Valor turned to him. I do. He fought it. I know he did. There's a way to break this. Lyrian nodded slowly. Perhaps there is, but either way, we must prepare. She turned to the assembled generals, warriors, and mages, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had made a decision. Veymara marches to war. The city stirred. Messengers were sent to neighboring cities. Banners were raised. Weapons were forged. Soldiers trained through the night. The mages of the Sanctum Arcanum prepared their most potent spells, and the clerics readied their divine wards. For the first time in centuries, Veymara was going to war. And this time their enemy was one of their own. Far from the city, beneath the ashen sky, the ruins of Castle Veymar stirred. The once silent halls were now alive with movement, but it was not human. A vast army of the dead moved through the ancient fortress, their glowing blue eyes reflecting the fires that now burned in the great braziers of the castle. At the center of it all, two figures stood atop the castle's highest balcony, overlooking the growing horde. Edric Veymar, the Reaper King, stood in his dark robes, his flaming scythe resting against the stone rail, his void-like eyes gleaming with amusement. And beside him stood Calthus, no longer the man they had once known. He was taller now, broader, his gray skin etched with dark veins, his muscles brimming with unnatural power. His eyes, once gold, now silver voids, glistened with something not entirely his own. A dark tome floated before him, its pages turning on their own as Calthus studied the runes within. His fingers twitched, his shadow shifting unnaturally at his feet. He was learning. Edric watched him with approval. You take to magic quickly, a fine trait for my chosen. Calthus didn't respond immediately. His hands lifted, and from the shadows 3 skeletal figures rose, clad in rusted armor, their empty sockets glowing with unnatural light. He lowered his hand, and they knelt before him. He exhaled slowly. It felt right. It felt easy. Edric smirked. Your friends will come for you, you know. Calthus's expression didn't change. He glanced out over the endless ranks of undead, then toward the distant horizon, toward Veymara. He spoke softly. Let them try. End of Book 1.